Hey Sparkly Beans! I'm here today to talk to you about the topic of consistency because it has been coming up a lot. I have a few different clients right now as a neuroemergence guide, and every single one of them, this topic came up in our most recent session. Also came up with a couple of friends and with myself, and it keeps pinging around in the universe, so I wanted to do a little video with some takes from a neurodivergent perspective, and particularly an ADHD friendly one about consistency. If you're new here, hi, my name is Avery, and I help justice-aligned, neurodivergent, and nerdy humans to cultivate ease and self-trust for growing into our emerging future. And this topic of consistency is something that has been rattling around in my head for a couple months, particularly the idea of inconsistent consistency, which I'll talk more about towards the end of this video. But I wanted to actually talk about consistency a little more broadly. This may be on the longer side, so grab yourself a beverage. I'll include timestamps below so you can skip ahead to topics that you're most interested in. But to give you a little bit of an introduction, I think a lot of us tend to want to be more consistent in certain areas of our lives, whether that is having a consistent routine, maybe having consistent sleep schedule, consistent performance, like whatever that is. Consistency is something that comes up. And I think often, I'm recording this in January, often this will come up around the process of setting resolutions. Even if you don't do resolutions, when there's a reset to a year, I think it's just often on a lot of folks' minds. Like, how can I be more consistent? How can I come back to something that I've wanted to be consistent in? And I especially find that this comes up with ADHD clients. A lot of times if we have ADHD, we might have a lot of shame around our ability to show up consistently. We might feel really scattered, and also feel like it would be supportive for us to just have some consistent routines, for us to have things that we're doing regularly that are supportive, and at the same time it can be a struggle to build these. And so, I think this is part of a larger tension between wanting to acknowledge, particularly, if you're in the spiritual space, if you're in the anti-capitalist space, if you're in the justice space, you probably have this idea that, yeah, we should acknowledge that we are imperfect, and that the expectations of our culture sometimes for us to be perfect robotic machines is not realistic. We might understand that, but then have a tension between also having things in our lives where consistency could be helpful or meaningful or help us to make change. And so that's really what we're talking about today. I've noticed that we often try to do this introduction of consistency in a kind of rigid way that doesn't necessarily match our neurotype or our needs more generally. And so this video is for folks with ADHD, but also anyone who struggles with finding consistency. I'm going to first talk a little bit about what consistency actually means, some definitions of consistency. Then we're going to talk about how to view consistency in a less rigid way. I'm going to talk a little bit about observation, mindfulness, and awareness, and how they play into that. Then we will talk about building consistency when you're kind of starting from scratch, when you don't have any, or when you don't have any in a particular area. And so like building habits, for example, building routines, ways to do that aren't just going to fall apart. And then finally, I will talk about this idea I have of being literally consistently inconsistent, and how that can be a really freeing approach, especially for ADHD folks. So, hope you'll have a seat and join this discussion with me, and let me know in the comments if you have thoughts about anything I've shared here, if you have questions. I also just want to make a quick mention of a self-paced audio course I have. If you find these ideas interesting, this is something that I go into with lots of different exercises and like practical ways to apply it, as well as with a kind of unique lens where I teach through archetypes from the tarot. You don't have to know anything about tarot, but I use that as kind of a creative and intuitive approach to thinking about some of these topics, and then go much broader around this bigger question of the tension between wanting to acknowledge our imperfection, acknowledge our inconsistency, and also be able to build supportive things in our lives. I do this in this course that is called Unproductive. It is at the time that I'm posting this, still available at a launch rate, and so I will include a link down in the description below. If you think at all that this kind of thing might be supportive and might be helpful for you, then I would totally encourage you to check it out. It was a real labor of love, and honestly, a kind of sum total of the body of work over about 10 years of being a productivity expert, and then realizing that the frame of productivity just like wasn't serving me. So I think it's particularly good for folks who are at this balance of, you know, systems and intuition and trying to find a healthy approach. So to get started, what does consistent even mean? Let's talk about that. So I went to the dictionary like you do, and I found an interesting, maybe a little clue as to why sometimes the idea of consistency gets a little muddled or jumbled, or maybe misunderstood as what is required to be consistent. So some of the definitions that I found, Merriam-Webster for consistent says, quote, marked by harmony, regularity, or steady continuity, free from variation or contradiction. So that's interesting. Even within that definition, I think free from variation or contradiction, those are two very different things to me, right? Free from any variation sounds very rigid, whereas free from contradiction sounds a little more flexible. Another definition in the same dictionary, another meaning of consistent, is showing steady conformity to character, profession, belief, or custom. For consistency in Merriam-Webster, again, like there's one definition that's kind of about harmony. So agreement or harmony of parts or features to one another or to a whole. And I want to like emphasize that whole piece. The idea of there being kind of a bigger frame that individual parts are consistent with. Harmony of conduct or practice with profession, firmness of constitution or character. So that one gets into kind of like a moral element, and a sense of like steady or firm. Wiktionary defines consistent as of a regularly occurring, dependable nature. So again, that dependable, it kind of has to me like a little bit of a moral flavor. The OED for consistency, one of the definitions, it's hard to access a full OED without like money, so I'm not going to get a whole OED subscription for one video, but one definition that I found quoted somewhere else was the quality of achieving a level of performance that does not vary greatly in quality over time. So I thought that was interesting because it gives a sense of like does not vary greatly, so there's a little bit of leeway, and then it's about quality of performance, and I think that is also interesting. Then the Cambridge English Dictionary, always behaving or happening in a similar, especially positive way, in agreement with other facts or with typical or previous behavior, or having the same principles as something else. I thought that one, I noticed that one because typical or previous behavior, it's a self-referential, right? It's like consistent with how you've been before. When I looked into the etymology of the word, I found that, you know, the very earliest meanings of consistent were generally more the kind of consistency rather, is the kind of consistency when you think of like matter, like consistency of a substance. A little different from the current meaning of the consistency of a substance, but it was that kind of meaning. But then you got from the 1650s the meaning of the state of being in agreement or harmony with something. So again, there's this like idea of harmony, idea of things that align or go together naturally. Then later we got the meaning from 1716 of steady adherence to principles, patterns of action, etc. So again, I'm noting that it's not necessarily steady or rhythmic or exact action, but patterns of action, principles, I saw another source that noting that this definition was kind of had the sense of like a work ethic. Then from 1787, the meaning of harmonious connection is in the parts of a system. The overall quality of being consistent with oneself, as in all parts working or being in agreement. So an example of this would be saying that there's consistency throughout a set of laws or a document. But you could also think of it's internal. You've probably heard the term, right? Internally consistent. I think this is useful because often when we think of being consistent, we think of a kind of rigid idea that is externally opposed, or might even have some expectations of what we imagine consistency looks like. But we can also think of internal consistency with ourselves, so with our values, with our abilities, with our previous actions. I would hold that when thinking about this. So there seems to be, the actual Latin roots of the word. There's a couple. One of them means to stand together, literally. So it has this sense of like steadiness or holding together, not falling apart. But then there's another one that has a bunch of different meanings, another Latin root that has a bunch of different meanings, including stop, stand, or halt, pause, or linger. So here we've got this idea of like steadiness or like reaching a final state. Harden, same. Agree with, so back to that harmony idea. Depend on, so that is that kind of moral sense of like dependability, maybe where that comes from. Continue, endure, or subsist. I find that interesting to think of like that root of consistency, that it's keeping up with something, not necessarily perfectly, but like it's enduring, right? Or literally just to exist is another meaning of that Latin root. So there seems to be some maybe relationship to sustainability. Even if you go back to the idea of consistency in terms of matter as having this sense of like holding together, not falling apart, being enduring, being steady, being stable. I think what's interesting in that regard is that a practice that you cannot actually continue wouldn't be consistent. So even if if you want to like do something every day, if you can't hold that every day enduringly, then it's kind of losing some of that sense of consistency. So a consistent practice is often the practice that, it's kind of self-referential, but the practice that you can consistently practice. And then there's also, as I mentioned, the sense of like compatibility, of harmony, of agreement. So the idea of like being a part of the whole. This sense of like, does it fit the pattern? Something that's consistent goes together. There was one example was like consistency of a color scheme. So the color scheme was consistent throughout the house. It doesn't mean that everything in the house is the same color, note. But it means that there's not a jarring color, right? Like it's all kind of following a scheme or a pattern. And so we have there is this like value judgment you start to see with consistency, but that seems to have been added a little later on. And when you look at like modern common usage, I think you get a lot more of that value judgment. And there, like I mentioned at the beginning, there is, I think, some variance in how we use it in just like common usage, whether we're talking about always being the same or similar. Are we talking about always being the same? Or are we talking about always falling within a general pattern? And then there's this kind of creeping in moral tone of like productivity, where it's like, can we rely on you? Are you consistent, right? Are you gonna show up? I noticed some of the example sentences are legal. They come from the legal context of like, were the statements consistent as a way of determining whether somebody's lying, kind of thing. So that has that sense of like, is this a reliable witness, right? I don't know that that's very helpful, that meaning of consistency, even though it like gets this moral tone gets like put in there. I don't know that it's actually that helpful when you're thinking about things like behavior, routines, things that rely on your energy, your mood, and other sort of just general vagaries of human existence. So we know that, I mean, it's one thing to say, yeah, if you're on the witness stand, like, be consistent. Although I would also argue, there are some human vagaries of like memory that come in there. But we're talking about some sort of like objective fact, and like, maybe you're doing math and you're like, are the numbers coming up consistently? Like, that's very different from consistency in the sense of human behavior, because we know that human bodies, human minds, they're not metronomes, right? And so I think it's more realistic, and if we want to be moving away from this artificially imposed idea of productivity, of just being like, over and over and over again, I think it's more realistic to think of consistent in that sense of adhering to principles or patterns, or being in harmony with a way of being, consistently showing up, in a particular way, with understanding that what that actually looks like is gonna depend on a bunch of different variables, rather than the sense of do it the same way every time, do this exact activity every day, every week, apply the same level of performance every single time. And I'll also note that none of these definitions actually say, daily or weekly or any particular time scale, but I think often our brains think this is how that works. I've noticed that a lot of times when I work with ADHD clients who are trying to establish something, the default is to go to daily. And I think sometimes that, I understand, and I've done it myself, that sometimes daily is about out of sight, out of mind, and how we have such poor memory that, we might forget that we're doing a thing if we try to do it weekly or monthly or some other like longer time scale. But also, whatever the time scale, hitting something on calendar time doesn't always work. So I think a more realistic approach, especially if you're somebody who does have challenge with consistency, is to work with your natural cycles, the cycles that you already have in your body. And this is a great practice as well for body awareness, for intuition, for mindfulness, for trying to kind of like get back to more natural rhythms, to reconnect with nature, right? Because we know that in nature, very few things just happen robotically at the same time every day, every week. And I think we know this for humans as well. Like, most people don't start a new habit, for example, and expect to get it perfect. But what we do is that we allow ourselves a very limited amount of leeway. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But I think it's useful when you're struggling with consistency to ask yourself, like, what are your own meaningful cycles? So, like, what periods of time do you actually feel, or do you have a sense of? And it may not be entirely internal and body-based. It may be that there are like useful external cues that have to do with, your family, your work, events that you do. There may be things, and of course, I'm sure if you're ADHD, you've heard of these ideas of kind of cueing things to other things. That doesn't work for everybody. I mean, I know I have a very flexible life, and it means that there's actually very few things where I can be like, let's cue the new habit to something I already do. Whenever they say something like that, just do it at the same time that you do something else every day. I'm like, something else I do every day? That's an assumption. But a lot of folks do have that. So it might be externally imposed, but you can also like think about your own body cycle. So what do you notice about how things fluctuate for you? Are there particular times, it might be like times of the day, times of the week, times of the month, where you have more energy, less energy, where your moods shift, where your like physical energy, but also like maybe your focus is different? Are there basically, there are things that internally you notice, and it might not be a regular cycle in the sense of like, ah, yes, my energy tends to go in 3-day cycles or something like that. But you can ask yourself, are there particular like states of being that you recognize? Like, oh yeah, sometimes I get in this like creative chaos kind of place, or sometimes I get real introspective. You know, like, what do you notice about your own states and how things tend to fluctuate? And you can also ask yourself, like, how have you struggled in the past with consistency, and what kinds of consistency, and kind of what was the sticking point? When you think about this, one thing that's useful to consider is that scale really matters. So when we say consistent, whether something looks consistent actually depends on how large the time scale is. So a good like way of thinking about this, if you're, I mean, I don't love it because it is like a very capitalist example, but it's one that for a lot of folks, you know, understand, is the stock market. So if you look at the stock market fluctuation in a given week, it's going to tend to be all over the place, right? It's going to tend to look really jagged. Even if you look at a year, you're going to see a lot of ups and downs. But if you keep expanding that time horizon, it tends to be relatively steady over a longer period of time. I think that's true as well when we look, or that can be true when we look at our own consistency. That sometimes if we look at, you know, did I hit this thing every day? Did I hit this thing, you know, every week? It might look like, oh wow, I was really doing well and then I just dipped, right? But if we were able to keep going with the thing and not totally drop it, we might see that over time, those dips become actually pretty consistent. That we, you know, always tend to drop off. An example that I noticed in my own body is looking at sleep. Is that I tend to, you know, it can look kind of like up and down because there are periods where I will just stay up really late. I'll have trouble. I won't sleep very much. There are also periods where I don't sleep as much, but I do feel energy. There's some periods where I don't sleep as much and I do not feel energy. There are times when it's really easy to sleep and I sleep a lot. But when I zoom it out and when I started to look at like, okay, is there any pattern here? Then I noticed that there are certain times in a month where I tend to be more energized and there are certain times when I tend to be more tired, and that up and down is fairly consistent. Like for me, it's happening on a roughly like a monthly cycle. And you might notice similar things with other, like if you're trying to do a movement practice or other things that are body-based. You know, I think even with, I don't know a whole lot about this, but I think even like strength training, right? They tell you to take days off. In fact, you have to take days off for your muscles to properly build. And if you are somebody who does movement, you probably notice that there are times when your body just is not able to do the same kinds of movement that it was yesterday. And so instead of saying, I need to be, you know, consistently doing X number of repetitions of a movement, it can be, am I consistently showing up to some kind of movement, and, you know, I'm consistently doing it at the level that, you know, feels like X. I don't know how you describe it, but like feels like about right on this day. But what that is might vary, but I'm always like showing up to about what feels right on this day. Might be another example. If you think about your work, right, you might have, in a lot of jobs, you have kind of really busy periods and really slow periods. And sometimes we tend to feel like guilty when we're like, oh, we're in a slow period, I'm not doing much. But if you zoom out, you'll be like, well, that makes sense because I was really busy here and now I'm less busy. Even just the way you think about growth in a spiritual sense is there's always cycles of expansion and contraction. And so you can't expect to be happy and growing and like things are going great all the time. There's always going to be contraction. But if we expect that and we know that, it's a lot less disturbing because we know that that it will expand again. A common thing with ADHD that a lot of people are trying to find is a consistency of routine. So having some kinds of routines in our day. But, and this is supportive for some folks, and some levels of routine may be supportive for you, but a lot of us don't do actually that well with doing the same thing every day, and would work better in bursts. So maybe it's that we batch things, and that works well for us, but we do that batch regularly. So instead of being like, I'm going to do it every day, what if it's like, I do it a lot on this day, and then there's another day like that, and then there's another day like that. As we zoom out, if we look at this scale, it'd be like, well, I only did it one day out of this many. But if we go out, we go, oh, I did that one day, like over and over again. Or maybe it's just consistently putting in an effort on the days when we intuitively are like, yes, I have the energy to do so. And even if that's not a regular cycle, like that can be consistent as well. When X condition is met, then I'm consistently doing it. Like when I have that energy, I'm consistently doing it. So I also want to talk about, what if you're trying to build something new? Like what if you're trying to introduce something? Maybe you're trying to build a habit. Maybe you're just trying to introduce some consistency in, one of those things I talked about, like sleep as an example. So I noticed when I was looking at these definitions and etymology, there are also a lot of examples around athletes. So we use that term a lot with athletics. Does someone consistently, is somebody really consistent in their scores, in their whatever sport it is, right? In their scores, in their times, in their etc. When I was a kid, I used to love gymnastics. I used to love to watch gymnastics, and they would always talk about consistency. Was always a big thing that the announcers would talk about, because you would often have these gymnasts that would be really exciting because they would do this like wild trick, this tumbling pass or what have you, that was really impressive. But often that their kind of signature big move, they would not be able to consistently hit. This happened in figure skating as well. Like it might be, this person can do a quad, but like most of the skaters, at least at this time, could not do a consistent quad. Quad being 4 turns in the air. That would, and the announcers would kind of talk about this of like, well, it's great and it's exciting and it might mean that you get a really good score on the one day, but if you're looking at your lifetime performance, if you're looking at your performance as a gymnast, you want to have things that you can consistently hit. And there would often be these less glamorous, less kind of like fun athletes who just consistently scored well and tended to do the routines that they themselves could always hit. And so those athletes would do really well when the shiny, sparkly athlete fell, right? So if somebody made a mistake, you have this other person who's like, well, I just always, like, I might always score, 80% of what this person does on their best day, but like it's not always their best day. And so I thought that was a kind of interesting metaphor when thinking about consistency, because you have that idea of what can you do most days versus the big exciting thing but you can only do sometimes. You also have this idea, because they would also always talk about this, they would say, like in order to be consistent with something, and they would be really impressed. Like if somebody could do the big shiny trick and could do it consistently, they'd always talk about like, oh, she's done it hundreds of times in practice, every day she's doing this 20 times. Because it was very clear that in order to get to that point, you had to do it so many times that, you had muscle memory, that you were able to correct for different ways you might land, that, you're so like able to do this skill that even under really stressful, intense performance conditions, you could do it. And a lot of times, athletes can hit something in training, and then when it comes to like, it's the Olympics, the stress won't get to you. And so I was just thinking about how when we start something new, we introduce something new, we often overestimate what is realistic. It's the common challenge of like when you're starting a new habit and you do it great for a day or two. I do this all the time. I start something for a day or two and I'm like, yeah, it's working. And then like the first challenge, the first like performance conditions, the first, issue or just day I don't feel like it, then I might fall off. And often that's because the thing I set up for myself was realistic. And this is like ADHD people love novelty, right? Like it was realistic when I was excited and it was new as day one. But then it's trying to do it again. I think even if the thing seems very small, so sometimes it's too big, but even if it is reasonably pretty small and a small habit you're trying to introduce, if consistency itself is new for you, there's nothing you do consistently, if you rarely do things consistently, then we can overestimate how often we're able to do it. We can expect minimal variance. So I said I would come back to this. A lot of times we will give ourselves grace. And I notice this with talking with clients where they'll be like, okay, I want to try to do something every day. And I know I'm not going to get it perfect. But sometimes that grace that we give ourselves still has like a subconscious limitation to it. Let's say you're trying to do a daily habit. You might think to yourself, if I manage to do it 4 or 5 days in the week, then I'm going to consider myself doing okay. And that might feel really good. Like that might feel like, yeah, I'm giving myself all this grace. Like I'm telling myself that 4 or 5 days a week, I don't know how to do the math on that, but like 75% or so is a great score, right? And if you're somebody who grew up or who tends to have this, perfectionist idea of 100%, then yeah, that is like a difference. And that can feel like, yeah, I'm like really giving myself leeway and grace. I'm letting 70% be passing. It's okay. And also thinking of it that way of like percentage of total days in the week that I managed is a little bit of a misnomer because, if you have that attitude, you might say that if you did it 2 days in the week, you're really disappointed in yourself. Well, I would say you started from 0. So 2 days a week, that's what, a 20%, like, I don't know, how would you do that math? Well, you can't increase from 0, but you know what I mean, right? You're multiplying it. You're going from doing it not at all to doing it 2 days a week. Celebration! Yes, wonderful. So like, I really encourage people when they're starting new things to actually like celebrate yourself if you manage 2 days of the week. If it's, or if it's a weekly thing, you manage, 1 week in the month. It's like, that's more than 0. And then the trick is to like keep trying to do that. And then building a little more, keep doing that 2 days a week. You can still aim for every day, but like understand that like, you're building something from 0. And so you're always like, it's focusing on the increase over baseline rather than the progress to the goal, especially if your goal is pretty lofty. If you think about a gymnast who is learning a new skill, like they might start out and they get it 1% of the time. 0%, right? They're going to try it a bunch of times, they're not going to get it. And then they get to the point where they're like, yeah, I did it the first time. And they're proud of themselves. And then they're going to fall a lot more. And then they'll get it to 1%, and then 5%, and then 10%. And eventually they'll get to the point where they're, 80 or 90%. They're doing it all the time in their routine. But they'd also probably have points of plateau or even like dips where, they have a bad practice week and they're actually hitting it way less than they normally do. So if you have that, of course, it's like, being aware that that's not a failure, that's not a mistake, that's actually just like very normal. And so it's just continuing with that. And like, you can also like keep in mind that, a gymnast would continue to have like the skills that they can kind of do at their own level, even if they're pushing themselves with a new skill. And so, like that is kind of what we, being aware of like, what am I already doing? What is my baseline versus what's new? And even if you feel tremendously behind other people, if embarrassed that you can't do a thing, if you are like, man, I'm the biggest flaky pants, like I've just got to get things together, that rarely works. Comparing yourself to other people, comparing yourself to what seems like a normal expectation, and often normal, especially if you're ADHD, if you're autistic as well, like I am, we will often have weird ideas, like we don't realize they're weird, but like we'll have ideas of what normal is or what acceptable is or what average is that are like not really true. And so you can think about this as like they talk about this a lot as well with gymnastics, where if the gymnasts start noticing each other and they start watching each other's performance, they tend to freak out. Like they tend to get psyched out. You'll often see like there's a big applause for a star, and then the other person is just like trying to like do their stretches and like prepare for the thing and do not pay attention to the applause, because you start going, oh shit, they did really well, right? When they're only competing against themselves, that's kind of the goal, is to like really just be competing against yourself. And so you can think about the same thing. When I had like struggles with dental hygiene for a long time, which is a common thing for people with ADHD, it can be really shameful. And just tremendously isolating and humiliating, because it's not something that's like talked about a lot, and people who are neurotypical, think of that as like, what are you, a fucking child? It's like that level of hatred. Like I remember like there was a conversation when I was in law school. I remember somebody like talking about like somebody who didn't brush their teeth, and just like as if they should just die. And I remember thinking like, like, oh God, I have this shameful secret. If anybody finds out, I'm going to have to die, right? Like dramatically, like, and I don't think these people didn't know, like, they had no idea that they were, putting me in this level of emotional distress. But like, I think that's an example of where the assumption, the cultural assumption would be that like all adults or at least brush their teeth twice a day, struggle a little bit with flossing, but like, and so if you don't, it's like, I'm subhuman. How do I even, start this thing? And if you, by the way, if you struggle with dental hygiene, even if you never, ever brush your teeth, you're a human being and you're okay and you're doing your best. So like, love. But what I found was that, it felt humiliating to try to get on a consistent dental hygiene habit, to be like, oh, I can manage it, 30% of the time. Like that felt like I was just failing compared to, all other adults. Now I know that compared to neurodivergent adults, I'm pretty average. But if I thought about it again as like how much I was going up from zero, then I could celebrate myself. And I actually got a really great dental hygienist, who was fantastic, because she would be like, that's awesome. Like you're doing, most dental hygienists would not be like, great job, you're brushing your teeth 30% of the time. But she was like, look, you're doing something right consistently, and you're adding, and you're doing your best. And that got me out of the shame spiral, because if I thought about other people, I'd like looking at a toothbrush was triggering, If I focused on myself, I could like gradually build that habit. So sometimes you may find that you have to go a lot smaller than you thought you would, until you find the size of something that is right for you. You might think that something is manageable and small, and then you try to implement it consistently, and you're like, actually, I'm not doing too great, so now you gotta make it smaller. One example is working with a client who wanted a morning routine. A morning routine, which is a common thing that people try to implement, but a morning routine often has multiple steps. It might involve getting up at a particular time or getting up a particular amount of time before something. It might involve, doing things. Sometimes a morning routine involves doing things that themselves you don't really want to do. Even if it's things that you do want to do, it's just like it's adding in this level of consistency you've never had. And so rather than saying like, let's start with, here's what my morning routine's going to look like, and I'm going to set an alarm, and every morning I'm going to try to do the morning routine. my suggestion was like, what if your goal is to try as many mornings as possible to get out of your bed 15 minutes before your first call and to put some kind of food in your face and to drink some water, right? Like, what if we start there? What if we start with like that bit? You know, for others, it could be like a morning routine could be, okay, I'm gonna take, for me actually, my morning routine, and I don't have much of one, but like my starting point is that I started with, I'm gonna take my meds. And that's all. I'm gonna take my meds and try to cue that when I wake up I take my meds. And then it's like, okay, what, you know, I noticed that like I haven't taken my meds yet. Well, I'm not going to, like, I tend to get frustrated when I try to do things and my meds haven't kicked in. So like, okay, so what are some things I can, that make more sense when I'm in that space? And even though I didn't necessarily immediately go like take my meds and then do these other things, when I defaulted myself into like, oh, I'm gonna work on something, and then I realized my brain was like really foggy, I was like, oh right, because my meds haven't kicked in yet. That's right, when my meds haven't kicked in yet, I brush my teeth, right? So it's like being like really gentle, but kind of finding ways to do like a little bit at a time. So it's worth considering, like, are you adding on too much too soon? Is there anything that you do have reliable at this point in time? And then how can you add on a little bit to that? And so if you're starting from scratch, it's starting with something really small and then adding on. If you already have something that is consistent for you, it's like, how do I increase bit by bit? And again, like with the gymnastics metaphor, maybe there are some days when you're feeling really great, and so you go for the big trick. You know, you try to do the full morning routine, or you know, you try to like add a little bit, you know, onto the thing that you're doing consistently. That makes more sense for some things than others. But trying to like optimize your entire routine or your entire day or like a big thing is kind of like, and we often do this, we're like, okay, like what's the best, you know, what's the most optimal, okay, if I get up at this time and I do this and this will work and this will work. And it's like, it makes me think of a gymnast who composes their entire routine of like really difficult tricks. Like there's a great chance that they're not going to do well. So allowing, like having some things in there that are already easy, already consistent can be helpful. I know it's really easy to want to get excited and to like want to do a bunch of different things, but we generally only have mental space, executive function to be actively focusing on and prioritizing very few intentions at one time, especially things that are new. So keeping that in mind. And then when you have challenges, when you have difficulties, you can think of it as being kind of like the gymnast at the Olympics. So, you know, if you're I know it's very common to like start doing a habit and you're like doing pretty well, maybe you're doing it for a few weeks, and then you have a trip. And I've had this happen where like I was very proud of myself. I was like even like 30, 45 days of like doing something fairly consistently. And then I had to travel, and it was like I didn't do it while travel, and then I never did it again. So, you know, you can be aware of that if you're going on a trip, if there's a, you know, really stressful week, just having grace for yourself, and just like trying to come back to it, and not worrying about that period of time and the fact that you're not quite up to the Olympics level yet. That's okay. The other thing about practicing consistency is it is practicing. And so practicing is like data gathering. You're learning from yourself what doesn't work. You're learning where you need support, what is hard, what isn't hard, because sometimes you'll find surprisingly that things are easier than you thought, what actually motivates you. But building consistency is also naturally a slow process. And so if you know, again, like if you want to do something daily, starting by hitting it once a week, adding little as you can, and then noticing like what mindsets and patterns are tripping you up, and just having some attention to those. You can keep in mind as well that effort stacks. And so like if you're looking at something that's really big that requires a long-term commitment for it to be meaningful, like let's say you're considering like a university program that you know would require you to show up consistently for a number of years, and you're kind of like, could I even do that? Is there a way to do a smaller experiment to like find out, could you do it? Like what would that actually be like? To like build some kind of muscle memory or build some tracks in your mind for consistency there, and to see, like, does it actually work for you? Do you actually like it? Again, like something that an athlete found completely impossible at one stage in their training might be totally easy and normal at another. And so like even you can think to yourself, like, even if right now you feel like a total train wreck, or just fine, can you think of anything really tiny that you do consistently? This may be really hard, but like I thought about it, and I was like, well, when I was a kid, I pretty much never remembered to wear my glasses, and I would like resist it, and I didn't want to do it. And when I thought about it, I was like, oh, I don't want to wear my glasses, even though I couldn't see that well without them. I was just like, no. Now maybe this is not a great example because as an adult I really can't see, but like I developed that habit eventually. The same thing with like drinking water. I used to be like, ooh, I don't want to drink water, and now it's just like I just drink water. It's just kind of there. So there's probably something like that for you that you can say, look, I have evidence that I'm able to do this. You might notice that the primary tool that we're working with here is really a mindfulness tool. It's awareness, it's observation, it's, what am I noticing? What can I learn from practicing? What do I learn about what's realistic for me, about what my cycles are, about how I fluctuate, about what is a reasonable scale to be aiming for consistency at. You'll often notice things about like what kind of good and bad days look like for you, and so you'll be able to tell like, oh, like, okay, I know that when I'm like this isn't going to happen. You'll notice like how your energy, your mood, other factors fluctuate as you're practicing trying to do something. If you just kind of gently pay some attention to like what's happening here, you'll often find that there might be some underlying resistance that you need to work on as well. And you can experiment with different ways to actually carry out the intention of the practice. Maybe you can tweak the practice itself and figure out if that works. But your mind very well may like hiccup. You may have like justifications and explanations where it's like, oh, well, I'm not doing it this day because of this, and I'm not doing it this day because of this. And like, when you get into that logical thing where you're trying to say, like, is it justified? Am I okay? Am I allowed to have a bad day? That isn't always very useful. But what is useful is that resistance itself is information. The fact that you're looking for an explanation, that you're maybe feeling resistant, maybe you're like, sometimes I know my voice like that can sound like a really stompy kid. Like, well, it's not fair that I would do this because of blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yeah, I hear you. Like that, you're having a hard time, right? That's information. So that can often point to like, there's some underlying trauma work to do. There might be an unmet need to address. It might even be that you're just pursuing a goal that doesn't make sense to you, and you're kind of like intuitively resisting it. So, it's going to vary from person to person. Like I've noticed from my own attempts at these kinds of things that I have some very lifelong issues around effort that were a big power struggle around like when I was younger, just not feeling like I had a lot of control, being frustrated that I was required to do things for school or what have you that just didn't make any sense. Especially an autistic person, I was like, are you like, you want me to, this is silly. Like, why would I do this, right? And so understanding that and like being able to see the pattern that I was playing out was helpful in addressing that and like getting support and getting like help with that. I've noticed that I just have this story around like putting in effort sucks. Like I don't like effort. I like things to be easy. But then I realized that like if I collected evidence and that was like in my mind, like, oh, I notice this is coming up. Like, I'm kind of paying attention to where this comes up. I can actually collect evidence that that's not always true. That I actually do put in effort on certain things, and what is the pattern about those things. And I might even surprise myself with how much I can do, because if I have this story of like, I am a person who does not try, and I don't want to try, and I don't want to do things that are hard, then I might avoid things that are hard in a way that I actually can do, if that makes sense. So working with a coach, working with a therapist, like different kinds of supports can be really helpful here. You might also just notice that, like, wow, my life is way more full than I realized. You know, when you start to try to do things consistently and you notice the barriers that come up, it might help you to be more realistic about how much is in your life, and like, are you being too hard on yourself, and is consistency realistic in whatever area. It is often suggested, especially if you do have executive function challenges, and specifically ADHD, to come back to the why or the purpose for the thing. Like, why am I doing this? So, you know, if it's something like body and health related, you know, like, oh, like I'm doing this because I feel stressed out and tired all the time, and so like I know that that's like my motivator for going to sleep. And we do know that ADHD motivation works better that way, if you can tag it to something meaningful for you. But also, like, that it doesn't always work, because some whys are like a lot less exciting than other whys. And executive function struggle is real, even if you do have joy about something, even if you're like, yes, I really like care about the big goal, you know, sometimes it's hard. It can be useful to break things down really small again. That can help, because sometimes it's like, I totally am committed to the thing, but it's really overwhelming to put in this kind of effort. But also sometimes you'll find that the thing you're doing, the consistency you're trying for, actually isn't connecting to the why or to the purpose, because it's not really in alignment, or it's not really necessary, or your brain doesn't actually care about that why, or your brain has a story that says, if I want my why, I need to do this. But actually that's not the only way you could get there, and it's not a way that's working for you. So that's information as well. Okay, so finally, what do I mean when I say inconsistent consistency, or being consistently inconsistent? Well, it might be. So we said all these things about if you're trying to achieve consistency, but I will also say that a lot of times you didn't need consistency in the first place. Not true for everything. Like, consistent sleep is often helpful for human bodies, but for some things, doing something at a regular pace, doing something at a consistent or predictable pace, you know, even over a large scale, is not actually that important. So I came across this email, it was an email from a while ago from Marley Grace, who was talking about how consistency of self. In other words, rather than being consistent with behavior, being consistent in who they are and how they operate, and understanding that part of their self is actually inconsistency, and that's not a bad thing. That's not an immoral thing, right? So I think this comes back to the meaning of harmony, or in alignment with principles. And Marley talked about devotion and like observation and gathering, exploring as like something that precedes discipline for them. That if they try to always like do it a certain way, it doesn't work. But that sometimes having this devotion, this meaning, this observation naturally will add on a kind of discipline or a kind of consistency. And Marley was specifically talking about the importance for them, because they're a manifestor in the human design system of gathering. You need to gather a lot, because a manifestor will kind of gather, and then like, boop, spark. And initiate energy. And so one thing I like about human design is that it acknowledges that everyone has different rhythms. And for some people, like a kind of more cyclical, predictable consistency is natural, and for others it's not. You know, my type, the generator, which is the most common human design type, is often stereotyped as kind of like, oh, these are the worker bees, right? It's like, it's, you know, you have consistent ability to like put in consistent effort and energy. And when I first read that, I was like, the fuck? And I do human design. I do neuroemergent human design readings. So you can check out the link to work with me below if you're interested in that and you want to know what your type is and how it works. And at some point I'm going to do something specifically for ADHD generators, because I think that's just like a confusion about it. It's not that we're able to like put out consistent effort all the time towards anything. It's specifically effort towards the things that like light you up and bring you joy and are meant for you. And that's a very different perspective. So for me, I was like, you know what? I will not, with my neurotype, I will never in my life be a super consistent person. I just won't. This is not a thing. There might be certain things I'm able to be consistent for a season or even for a long time, but like very few. I'm going to be all the fuck over the place. I'm going to be excited and passionate and like really engaged when I'm with you and I'm like, yeah, we're like talking about the thing. And I can totally like show up in a way that a lot of people will be like, that's 300%, right? Like I can, you know, if I'm passionate about something, like I really put my all into it. And then I'll totally forget that you exist until you remind me. like things fall out of my mind. And I could stress about that. I could try to change that. I could try to be, you know, really consistent in showing up, or I can just communicate it. I can just say, you know what, I struggle with keeping in touch. I struggle with, you know, yeah, I even have in my email signature, like, it's very clear that, like, I'm not going to, like, immediately respond to your email. I'm going to do my best, and, like, here's a rough idea of, like, I think I say in there, like, I try to respond to most emails in, like, 4 to 5 days, but, like, it's a very flexible timeline. I am not going to respond to most emails in one day, although I'm going to respond to some in one day, and that's the thing. It's, like, it's not consistent. You know, if it hits me the right moment and it's a thing I'm really excited about, like, yeah, respond to the email, and then, like, most of the time it'll take me a little bit. And so I'm consistent about communicating. Like, I'm consistent about, like, letting people know that I'm inconsistent, and that's just how I am. I changed my business model, or like what I was attempting to build with my business model, when I realized I've been trying to kind of figure out, like, what's the, like, sustainable long-term program that's gonna, like, meet my income needs. And I realized that, like, my energy, it's a much better use of my energy to just, like, bop around with what's exciting me and to be like, we're gonna have a pop-up offer, and now we're talking about this, now we're talking about human design, now we're talking about tarot, now we're talking about, you know, whatever. And there's a general bubble of the kinds of things I talk about, but I realized that, like, I show up more consistently excited and able to serve people if the topic of what I'm doing is allowed to fluctuate with what I'm interested in any given moment. And so I can't promise you that I will do the same, like, live offer twice. I can't promise you that the current one-on-ones I do will be available forever. In fact, I know they won't. I can promise you they won't. So that's the thing. I'm consistently inconsistent. I can promise you that things will change. The only constant is change, you know. But I can promise that whatever I'm offering right now, you're going to get certain things. You're going to get a neurodivergent centered approach. You're going to get a queer, you know, informed approach. You're going to get an anti-capitalist. Like, there's certain values that I'm totally consistent with. I can promise that, you know, the way I will show up looks like this, but I can't necessarily promise you consistency of the what. I can promise you consistency of the how. And so that's one thing to think about. Like, maybe your how is more consistent than your what. And this is another version of scale in a way. Like, I can't be like the consistent business that is like, I'm the person to go to, the normal marketing advice. I'm the person to go to for ADHD generators, right? Like, that's the thing I'm really excited about at this moment, but like, I can't say, like, this small niche will, like, always be my thing, and I'm going to build an audience around that. And when I try to do that, it's like, it's actually really disruptive, because I'm like, yeah, it's working, and then, like, shit, my interests change. I got to totally change my messaging. But I can consistently show up as a brand that centers neurodivergence, that centers curiosity and exploration and gentleness with self, and, you know, the kind of, like, general, more or less blend of, like, this kind of spiritual intuitive approach and a more systems kind of nerdy approach, like, because that's me. I'm, like, consistently showing up as Avery. I can be a consistent Avery business. And so for people who resonate with that and where, like, the way I show up means something to them, then, like, great, that's awesome. And by the way, if that's you, join my newsletter. But yeah, like, I have a newsletter below. It's where, you know, you get most of my stuff. So I'd love to see you there. But, like, you know, the folks who've stuck around with me you know, are people who like my voice resonates with, and I can give myself permission for that. I've also noticed that, like, so, you know, this observational practice, like I've noticed that my attention has cycles of about 1 to 3 months. And so I can use that observation, expect that to generally be true, and I can allow permission for my hyperfixations. So, you know, if you have hyperfixations, like, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that instead of like buying all the yarn, if knitting is one of yours, you know, instead of like doing the thing where like we get really excited about a new hobby when we're ADHD, we buy every supply that would last us for 3 years. If we know that our interests don't last 3 years, then like, why do that? I mean, why do that is impulsivity, but that's another topic. But knowing that, like, rather than getting excited about a new hyperfixation and being like, this is the thing, this will change my life, this will be my whole life, knowing that like it won't, it's going to be 1 to 3 months. And so I can, you know, not try to plan my whole life around them and then be disappointed. I can instead be like, wow, I'm really excited about this. Like, what can I do in this 1 to 3 months that I know this energy is going to stick around for? Like I said, like, this doesn't, you know, apply to every kind of consistency, but I think applying an expectation of consistency to everything is unnecessary. What are the things that really matter that they're consistent? You know, it might be brushing your teeth. It might be taking your meds. It might be, you know, that consistency of something like sleep or eating, like, could be really, like, supportive to work on, but trying to also be consistent with other things isn't as necessary. You know, I can consistently work on things that bring me joy. I can make a commitment to that, and I have, but that won't always be the same thing, and that's okay. I can consistently give you love when we see each other, but I can't consistently check in with you. I can do a really awesome job at a month-long effort, but I can't plan to offer that same thing every 6 months. So shifting your expectation in that way can be really powerful. So you might think about, like, what would be the equivalent of that for you? And if this is you, like, a few ways that you can proceed if you find yourself to just be an inconsistent person and you're trying to, like, make peace with that. So one is, like, you can keep checking in on something without necessarily having a particular plan or timeline for it, trying to do, like, the progress to goal kind of thing. So if you know that you want to work towards something, work on something, you can just keep it in your awareness, and you can have, you know, a way, instead of having like the detailed project task list, like, do I want to do something towards X theme today? Is there anything here I want to do today? And you can just and that can be your consistency. It can be as simple as, am I feeling this right now? No, not really. Okay, great. And if you notice that you're never feeling it, then maybe you question whether the thing is for you. But, like, you know, that's one way to do it, is like just checking in on what might be next. Number 2 is allowing yourself to have deep, brief focus on things in rotation. So instead of saying, I'm going to write a post every day, I'm going to write 5 posts at once. So if you find that you're somebody where batching works, where, like, you're, I think it's motivation breeds motivation. Like, there's the thing that is sometimes talked about neurodivergence, where it's like, once you've gotten over the initial hump, that sometimes once you're able to start working, like, keep working. Not to the point that you're burnt out and your dopamine's all over the place. And maybe I'll talk about that in another video. But if you find that you have the energy and you're able to stick with something and you're feeling good about it, sometimes I will, like, impose. I'll be like, okay, great, I did the thing for the day. I was only supposed to do 1. It's like, oh, I could do 5, because I know I'm not gonna feel like it anymore this week. So looking for ways that you can kind of, like, focus in and go deep is allowed. Or it could be, you know, if something is calling me, if I'm feeling like a desire to engage with something that's strong, then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to dive right into that, and I'm going to do as much as I want to, or I'm able to, as feels good to do on that thing. You know, I'm not going to, like, make a note and say, oh, I was really excited about this, but there's 17 other things I need to do on my to-do list today. you can instead have the approach of like whatever it is that's really like feeling motivation to like, let's do that thing. Number 3 is instead of having a target frequency, you can do something more as like a match. And what I mean by this is it's sort of a version of the like pinning habits to other habits, but I'm not talking here about, I'm not assuming you have any regular habits. I'm not talking here about that kind of regularity, but more, are there things that you like to do consistently that matters less in terms of time and more in terms of responding to something specific. So for example, journaling is a good example of this. Instead of being like, I'm going to journal every day or every week, or every Friday or something, it is saying, when I'm feeling a strong emotion, or when I'm feeling the urge to like go to social media on something that feels like it wouldn't be that healthy, then I'll journal. So trying to have some, and again, not 100% consistency on this, because sometimes you'll be like, I don't want to fucking journal, but like, it's a little ping that says, do I want to journal? Or it could be like, I've been trying to, not very successfully admittedly, but I'm trying to implement this of like, if I'm feeling like kind of sleepy and unfocused, to consider doing some movement, because that's actually a good time, and it's not the same time every day. And it's not even every day, but it's like, if I'm feeling this way, I can respond to it with this thing that would be supportive. Or if you have a particular thing you're focusing on right now, you know, I'm going to look for opportunities to apply that focus. If I'm feeling a need for connection, then like when things that come up, I'll just keep in mind like connection. We're thinking about connection. We're just having that in the back of our mind. And then if something comes up, we're like, oh, that's an opportunity for connection. Might be a good idea to grab. And then number 4 is to try to zoom out and look at the bigger category. So instead of a particular and a specific practice, you know, I'm gonna, like, an example would be, instead of saying I'm gonna run every day, it could be, I'm gonna find some sort of movement that feels good for my body every day. Instead of saying what's like a fun thing? What is fun? Instead of saying like, you know, I'm going to do X thing that's fun, I'm going to just try to do something fun every day. And again, it doesn't have to be every day, but like, you know, every whatever. But if you're finding that like doing that specific thing, sometimes having a menu of different options, and it can be a literal menu you can write down. I'm going to do something from this menu consistently, but it might not be that you can do the same thing consistently. So I guess to summarize this rather long video, so hey, you made it to the end, yay. You know, it's less about, consistency is less about, let's knock over the lamp, walking in a straight line. And it's more about observing what unfolds on your meandering path. It's more about learning about yourself. It's more about experimenting with what works and doesn't work, and trusting that, and allowing that to be present, and noticing where you might need more support, rather than strict adherence to a particular expectation or goal. I think is the best way I've found to approach consistency as someone who is naturally inconsistent, and possibly, like me, your ADHD specifically. Again, if this has been helpful, link in the description for the launch price on Unproductive, which is a self-paced course. It is intentionally designed to be very neurodivergent friendly. There's multiple modes of engaging with it. There's all sorts of different kinds of exercises and activities that you get along with it. It's a self-paced audio course, so you can listen to it like a podcast, but it also has a very well edited and like tagged and linked kind of transcript. So you can read it like a book, and you can use it as reference volume to like jump into the topic you need, because it's, you know, searchable, and there's like quick links and things in there. And then there's a full workbook that's full of different things that are really designed to be a lifelong reference guide, where you can jump into whatever might be serving you, wherever you might need support. There are things about this specific topic, but also all sorts of different ways of healing from productivity culture. So ways of dealing with your time, your energy, with burnout, with motivation, you know, topics galore. So it's again, like it's currently priced for, you know, some limited amount of time. I haven't decided how long yet, but it is currently priced pretty low for what you're getting. And so I would love it if you check out that link. I'd also love it if you sign up for my newsletter below. That is the best way you can find out about me and what's going on. And you'll also see links below to support the channel, to book one-on-one, etc. So yeah, let me know if you know, your experiences with consistency, how it feels for you, how this lands, if you have any questions, if there's anything you'd like me to go into, maybe in a shorter video, in more depth on a specific thing that I covered here. And I hope you have a great day.